that we have these sort of sessions on a regular basis, and perhaps we should find other opportunities to have them even more regularly than we do at the moment. So we've got a very full program, so I'm going to crack straight on. We've got 4 speakers. Myself, Peter Godfrey-Fawcett, I'm the Science Advisor, now in the Strategic Information and Evaluation Department. And then we have, from the HIV department, Meg Doherty, who's the coordinator for treatment, Rachel Bagley, who's the coordinator for prevention and key populations, and Martina, who I think is the coordinator for, who's within the treatment team, but works on pediatrics. I promoted her briefly. So, let us go straight on. I'd like to start off by just pointing out how accessible CROI is, that all the materials from CROI are available on the web, many news and blog sources, and the 4 of us and others who are at CROI are all very available for further discussions or questions. It's a big meeting with multiple technical tracks, so we're not going to be able, even in this hour session, we've got an hour now, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end, making a total of 90 minutes. Aiming to finish at 3:30 Geneva time. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the politics, incidents, PrEP, implementation science, tuberculosis and cure. You can see that's already a lot for 15 minutes, so I shall keep going. CROI, for those who don't know, started in 1992, and in many ways it started as a reaction to the US ban on HIV positive people being allowed into the US. So the International AIDS Conference that was slated for Boston had to be moved to Amsterdam in 1992, I think. And as a result, there were many American scientists who weren't able to go. So they said, well, let's organize our own conference. And that was the genesis of CROI. So it came out of a sort of political environment. And since then, it's become really the preeminent clinical research conference on HIV, specifically bringing together clinical researchers from America, but now increasingly from around the world, so that about half the attendees come from around the world. So it was particularly challenging, really, that this year's CROI happened immediately after the executive order for the travel ban, and there were many people, in fact, who didn't go to Seattle because of the travel ban, and the CROI organizers were very quick to point out that this wasn't their wish at all, and to distance themselves from that executive order. Okay, on to the content, and I'm going to talk a little bit about incidence studies and things that had gone on. A highlight was the long-term study that's been going on in Rakai in Uganda. So, as many of you will have heard of data that's come out of Rakai over the years, this is a large community-based study of over 30,000 individuals, and they've seen incidence gradually fall from 1.1, 1.2 down to 0.6, a 42% reduction. And they've been looking carefully at what could explain that fall in incidence rate. And they see that it really is a combination of factors. ART has been scaled up, circumcision has been scaled up, there has clearly been some change in behavior, with sexual debut occurring later. There has been a reduction in multiple sexual partners. There's been very little change in condom use. And so they've been able to look and see that all of those things have been necessary, and no one alone can explain the reductions that they've seen in incidence. So it was a big advocacy moment, if you like, for combination prevention, rather than the idea that prevention comes from just one thing alone. It should be noted that during the time of the study, the population in Rakai has grown by about 42%. And of course, if incidence rates fall by 42% and the population grows by 42%, the number of new infections has hardly changed. And this makes us remember how important demography is for the HIV epidemic, and the bulge of young people coming through makes our job in prevention even harder, because there are more and more young people who are at risk of HIV. Similarly, from the US, there was largely encouraging news. Overall, a decline of 18% over the past 6 years in the number of new infections, down to 37,600 new infections in 2014, the last time it was collated and put together. Most of those happening in the grey, in gay and bisexual men. And you can see that there have been declines in heterosexual, in people who inject drugs. In some of the gay and bisexual age groups, there have clearly been declines, but overall, amongst the gay and bisexual group, and that's the nomenclature used by CDC, which is why I'm using that term now, overall in gay and bisexual men, the number of infections has risen, and that's because the middle age group has risen quite a lot. So they still have a focal epidemic, and they need to pare down on where the real infections are occurring. Big geographic variation again. You can see that in different states, the annual decline has been variable from states that are really doing pretty well, like the Washington, D.C. area, but other, particularly the southern states, doing less well, and the southern states have a higher preponderance of the HIV in the US. Concerning trends in the gay and bisexual males, particularly 25 to 34-year-olds, rising quite steeply. And for the first time, we've seen more rise in the Latino and Hispanic community, also going up. So I think we're beginning to see this parts of the HIV epidemic being controlled, parts of it not, and it makes us have to really focus our efforts and understand the epidemiology for where control is happening. In each of the slides, which will be available, I've put a link at the bottom for those who want to click and actually hear the presentation. That's usually 15 minutes of presentation on this particular topic. The other approach to incidence have been these huge population-based health impact assessments. Now, you've heard PEER, run by PEPFAR through ICAP. They were already released at the World AIDS Day last year, so they've been out there. There were some further analyses presented at CROI, which actually showed very much the same as we'd already heard. So what they are big studies in 3 African countries so far, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi. They show, as expected perhaps, that when we look at prevalence across the whole country by age, in the top left panel, women get HIV sooner than men. They show in the bottom panel viral suppression, that women tend to be more virally suppressed than men. And they show in the right-hand panels that there's big geographic variation, with variation in prevalence from 11 to 22%, depending which province of Zimbabwe you're in, and viral suppression varying between 55 and 66%, depending which province you're in. So again, making us think about a nice snapshot for different countries with similar patterns in Malawi. North-south divides we've known about a lot in Malawi. But notice that viral suppression in the bottom half is not always following where the prevalence is highest, so it doesn't always match necessarily, and that means that we can focus our programs perhaps more effectively. And again, for Zambia, higher prevalence in the west and in Lusaka, less viral suppression in the more rural areas away from the line of road, very similar epidemiology. So that was 30,000 about people per country sampled, and it allows you to get good estimates of prevalence and good estimates of viral suppression. It still allows you to only get a very crude estimate of incidence. So the incidence estimates are only for the whole country. They can't be separated out, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And in fact, the incidence match very well with the incidence estimates that have been coming out of the spectrum models for Zambia and Malawi. The incidence estimate for Zimbabwe is slightly lower and will lead to a recalibration of the spectrum estimates for Zimbabwe, which will bring it down a little bit. So in general, I think they were rather encouraging for seeing how the modelling goes, and an incidence of, for those 3 countries, of around 0.5%. So that's 5 per 1,000 people in the 15 to 59-year-old age group becoming infected per year. Like all cross-sectional surveys, they have their challenges. They're representative surveys, but not everybody agrees to be in them. They can't get all the households to agree. They can't get all the members of the households to agree. So although they met their pre-specified targets for how many people they wanted to be in the survey, actually there were 1 in 3 men not included in the survey of the population and 1 in 4 women. And of course that's not likely to be a random selection process. It's likely that people who hide when the survey is coming round maybe more or less likely to want to have an HIV test, maybe more or less likely to be HIV positive. So don't think that just because they're population-based surveys, they're necessarily more accurate than other ways we have. We have to triangulate and use different measures to be able to get an idea of the epidemiology. And also note that as a cross-sectional measure, although we can talk, and I think Meg will talk a bit more about the viral load suppression and the sort of the good progress that's being made, it doesn't answer us the fundamental question as to whether that viral load suppression has led to a reduction in incidence, because it's a single measure of incidence rather than being able to see what's been happening to incidence over time. Before CROI, there was a technical working group on measuring incidence, and that was interesting. The new CDO lag assay is clearly the best of the assays that are out there at the moment. These are assays that take someone who's HIV positive and do further tests on that same blood sample to see how likely that person was to have been recently infected. And so that allows you to measure incidence, as they did in the FEAR studies, on a single sample. The trouble is that it's very dependent on the clade of HIV. And in the countries that we've done FEAR so far, it's all clade C. Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi all have almost entirely clade C. When you move to other countries and there's a mix of clades, it will be much harder to interpret, and in particular, you'll have to have an idea of what the distribution of clades in the sample that you were testing was. So it's not completely straightforward. Sometimes we think, well, we can just measure incidence and that's easy. Not completely easy yet. The second challenge is that the period in which you're recently infected is about 4 months. And so we said that we thought that overall incidence was about 5 per 1,000 population per year. Well, that's in a year, so in 4 months, that means that's 1 or 2 people per 1,000 who will come up on this assay. And obviously, that means you have to have a very big sample to allow you to make realistic and accurate estimations of the incidence. And that means that if you want to compare different groups, you have to have very big samples in each of those groups that you're going to compare, which is why in their current design, the FEAR studies are not able to tell you really much about whether incidence is different in different areas or in different age groups. They've tried to show differences by sex, but that's about as far as we can go. In PrEP news, I put news in brackets because really I'm not sure this is a news story, but it was the thing that people were most interested about, is that there has been another breakthrough in a man, a 50-year-old man who was taking PrEP reliably. He had blood samples taken where the 2 stars are, which showed high levels of tenofovir, and despite that, he went on and seroconverted and got HIV. There were some interesting things about it. It's in small, because I don't necessarily want to be prurient and you to focus too much on his sexual behavior, but there's no doubt that this was a man who was very sexually active. And there have been those who say that, well, maybe PrEP doesn't work if you really have damaged the rectal mucosa and that you've had such a lot of exposure, and that maybe this was at that end of the spectrum. We don't know, but certainly he was a highly active man, as shown in the table if you want to go to the site and look at it. It was also clear that he had a rather unusual response to becoming infected, in that when he was HIV negative at the start, obviously on HIV rapid tests and on combo tests, and then when he converted, he actually converted with an antibody but not an antigen being positive. So that's unusual. It's usually the other way around, that the antigen becomes positive first and then the antibody. And the Western blot at that stage was essentially negative and clear. You couldn't see antibodies in the Western blot. But he subsequently went on and the viral load did subsequently go up. There's no doubt that he did catch HIV despite being on effective doses of PrEP, but perhaps had a curious immune response to it. So that may be something about the individual. This is only the 3rd case of breakthrough out of thousands of people who've taken PrEP. It caused a lot of stir. I think it's interesting. I'm not sure it's important news for the rollout of PrEP. Nothing is 100% effective, and PrEP remains a very effective tool for reducing HIV. The future of PrEP, I think that, again, Meg's going to give you much nicer pictures of some of this in the treatment area, but I think that the future of PrEP may well end up being implantable TAF. TAF is a drug that's like tenofovir, but the advantage of TAF is that you need very, very much less, perhaps 100th as much. With tenofovir, we take 300 milligrams a day to stop us catching HIV. Well, if you imagine 300 milligrams a day over a whole year, that actually ends up being a whole handful of the active drug. And so it's difficult to imagine implanting that into someone's body because it would be a big lump, like a small melon or something under your skin. Whereas if you take TAF, that is 100 times more effective milligram per milligram, you start getting down into microgram doses, and you can imagine fitting them into small things like those matchsticks that the person on the right is holding that could be implanted under the skin, like hormonal contraceptive implants. And this was a study in CROI showing early work on these implantables in the animal models, and there are other models ongoing, and we can imagine that in the next few years we might have implantable matchsticks that are like hormonal contraceptive implants that might last for months or even a year at a time, and we know that when the drug is there, it's very likely that that would protect against HIV. There were other, so I think that's an exciting thing for the future. It's not quite ready to be implanted yet. The other PrEP bits and bobs, again, I think that Martina and Meg will talk about the overall HARMO study on maternal antiretrovirals. From the PrEP perspective, I think the important thing to note was that 24% of people in Botswana who are not HIV positive have an adverse birth event. So that's quite, it's including quite a lot of things that are not terrible events, but some of them are terrible. Stillbirth, small for dates, early gestational age, or neonatal death. Some of them are very bad, but it reminds us that quite a lot of pregnancies go wrong in some way. So a quarter of HIV-negative mums have abnormal pregnancies. When you take the HIV-positive mums who get antiretrovirals, that goes up to a third, 34%. So there are more adverse events in people who are HIV-positive exposed to antiretrovirals. It's still not really clear how much of that is the HIV, how much of that is the antiretroviral exposure. It's clearly relevant to discussions on giving PrEP to HIV-negative pregnant women. Molinar and his group from Paris, who did the nice IPAGAY study, have gone to the next step of not worrying about HIV, but worrying about STIs. And so in a similar way to IPAGAY, they have been using doxycycline to prevent STIs in a one-off dose after sex. Worked very well for syphilis, for chlamydia, didn't work very well for gonorrhea, probably because of resistance. There was nice implementation science in New York, showing that although people are quite adherent, a little bit of counselling can actually improve adherence still further. And there was reassuring news. Last year in Durban, there was anxiety that the Caprisa team had shown that topical PrEP doesn't work well in women who have bacterial vaginosis. A new analysis from the Partners PrEP study shows that it works fine when you take it orally, and bacterial vaginosis does not stop PrEP working. So encouraging news for PrEP generally. It works very well, and we have to get on with implementation. There was a strong focus on implementation science. The time is running out. This was in a pre-meeting, so I won't talk about it, merely to say that there are nice approaches that we know about, other than randomized trials that do give convincing-looking evidence. This was just one example, not to do with HIV, but you can see nice changes when health policy changed in continuous time series. So I'll wrap up by talking a little bit about tuberculosis, just two studies that I wanted to draw people's attention to. The Temprano study, which was part of the reason that we changed to Treat All for HIV, because it was a study that randomly allocated people to immediate antiretrovirals or deferred antiretrovirals. It also randomized people to give them isoniazid preventive therapy or not to prevent tuberculosis. And it found that both these interventions, starting antiretrovirals early or giving isoniazid, were both independently extremely beneficial. They've now done longer-term follow-up, and there's a reduction in death rate of 37% over the long term of 4.5 years in the people given isoniazid compared to those not given isoniazid. And the chart on the right shows that that's regardless of whether they were in the early ART, immediate ART group or not. So people should be getting both early ART and isoniazid. And early data from mixed TB, very encouraging. The first time we've been able to actually get good results in people with extensively drug-resistant or multi-drug resistant TB that was resistant, people were failing their treatment. Go to the website to look at it because we haven't got time to go through it now. There wasn't so much on cure and vaccine except for one exciting study very early again, Spanish study, the BCN02 study, which has been using the approach of waking up HIV with romidepsin, one of these drugs that tries to bring HIV out of hiding, and then giving a vaccine to BCN02. And they found a small number of patients who've been able to stop antiretroviral treatment, and for 12 to 24 weeks, a proportion of those patients have not relapsed. So they have to follow them very closely to look to see whether they relapse. So it's not yet a cure, but it's certainly a step that makes us encouraged that we are heading in the right direction for cure. ANRS, we're talking a lot about checkpoint inhibitors. They're complicated molecules on the outside of cells. Those who really like the cell biology should go to Abstract 234 to have a look at it, or come and talk to me and I'll read up about it before I see you. And there I will leave it and pass over to Megan. I'm sorry I've gone a couple of minutes over my 15 minutes.
So I was given the task to talk about new drugs, exclamation point, and HIV treatment care and adherence. So again, a wild ride through some of the new trials and the new ARV drugs, and I think the word here is non-inferiority, but there are a number of new drugs, dolutegravir, bictegravir, doravirine, and injectables, nanoformulations, and some new mechanisms. I'll talk a little bit about the fact that we have more evidence that treatment continues to work and some of the resistance studies that are coming out. A few slides on differentiated care, and then I'll finalize with what came out of our WHO think tank on treatment optimization. So all of these slides have a lot of information on them, and I'm really giving you the highlights so that eventually you can go back and take a look at them, because I think, just like Peter said, going and reading and actually looking at the abstracts, I think, would be more helpful than sitting here only. So the bictegravir is a new Gilead version of dolutegravir, and they came out with a series of studies at CROI, and essentially showing that they're equivalent to the dolutegravir. Were also a number of studies on how can we simplify and get down to 2 drugs from 3 drugs. A number of new studies of new mechanisms of drug. One, a doravirine, which is an NNRTI, old mechanism, but with a very high profile for resistance, and looking like it will also be a good player at some point, and more information about TAF, but not the information we need at WHO necessarily. So this slide just shows the outcome from the bictegravir paired with FTC and TAF versus dolutegravir, and as you can see, non-inferiority at the snapshot at 48 weeks, and essentially both are suppressing at 97 and 91%. So essentially the same, and no resistance were found in either arm of this study. In the next study, which is doravirine, is non-inferior to darunavir plus ritonavir. So now we're comparing a next generation NNRTI compared to using a very robust protease inhibitor. And these also had very similar results at 48 weeks in terms of viral suppression. So I'm not sure how we're going to take this further, but it's just interesting to say there are new drugs coming down the pipeline, and especially there are some robust NNRTIs that are being developed, sort of similar, and to take the place of what is evavirenz. Now, this Simplicity 2.0, there was at least 3 sessions on brand new drugs and how to pair drugs differently. And I think the whole idea is, we've had treatment optimization where 3 drugs have been the norm, but now many researchers are saying, can we get away with 1 drug? Can we do 3 drugs and then simplify to 2 drugs or 1 drug? What is the evidence around reducing the toxicity, reducing the burden? How simple can we make this? And there were a number of presentations on this, and in terms, they all have very interesting titles for their trials. The paddle trial, the sword trial, the limidol trial, the latte, well, those are injectables down at the bottom, and the flare. I'm going to show you some results from the sword 1 and 2. where essentially they switch, if a patient is on a suppressive ART, then they switch from that triple regimen to dolutegravir plus rilpivirine. And again, the word here is non-inferior. They seem to work equally well, so potentially safe to go from a 3-drug regimen to a 2-drug regimen. Although there was one patient that ended up having a K101 or a resistance pattern in the dolutegravir arm. In the next trial, the Lamidol interim analysis, where this was actually switched from an effective triple suppression therapy to dolutegravir and 3-TC, so another 2-arm true drug regimen. And again, we found this was effective at maintaining viral suppression at 48 weeks with just dual therapy. And in this trial, they said there was no integrase inhibitor identified. So again, thought to be safe, but we're going to hear more about this a little bit later. But here the bad news starts to come in. They're trying to go from 3 drugs to 1, and thinking that dolutegravir is going to be the ironclad ARV. But what we know is no ARV is ironclad. And this trial called DOMOMO showed that dolutegravir monotherapy is not sufficient. So patients who were suppressed on triple therapy were randomized to dolutegravir 50 every day as monotherapy. At 24 weeks, things looked great, but then the trial was interrupted because there was virological failure and resistance developing at 48 weeks. And there was at least 8 patients in that monotherapy arm who developed resistance, and at least 3 of them with integrase inhibitor resistance. So we're going to have to start thinking about in the future integrase inhibitor resistance as well. There was a whole series of other meetings, side meetings, and discussions around what else is coming down the pipeway. Long-acting ARVs that are in clinical development, and what you can see, the closest to the top are the closest to the ones that will eventually make it to us, say, in the next 3, 4, 5 years. So in the phase 3 trials, we have the cabotegravir long-acting injectable as well as the rilpivirine, and that's the LATTE trial, which I'm sure you're aware of, and now the LATTE trial has taken out to a longer period of time and is showing that the effect is maintained. Phase 2 trials, there's a number of them, and they're all so hard to say that I'm just going, they're all with so interesting names, but the first in phase 2, I'm not even going to say it. It's a long-term monoclonal antibody here, and I think that's making its way up. And again, I have a set of slides. Take a look at them if you have interest. And other broadly neutralizing antibodies are still there on the horizon, probably more likely to be paired in a cure-like remission type approach. And then there's some new mechanisms that are coming out in phase 1 and also in sort of really R&D development. And one is a non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase translocator inhibitor. That's down here. So some new mechanisms. And then a capsid inhibitor, which can modify and inhibit HIV at many different places along the pathway. So there is good news for the pipeline, I would say. So this slide just shows the outcomes that with the long-acting injectables, it has out to 48 weeks a maintained viral suppression by snapshot. Now, there was a great session by Charlie Flexner. If any of you know him, he's very, very funny in a very, I don't know, maybe British way. But he's coined a new term called extendification of existing ARVs. And this is making use of, so extendification is actually using the current ARVs we have, but working towards nanoformulations, so these very small particles, and then being able to extend their lifetime or their half-life in formulations. So tenofovir, lopinavir, ritonavir are all undergoing what we would call extendification trials. I mentioned that there are a number of implants that are being developed, sort of the Norplant for ARVs, and TAF is the first one. And as you can see, they put it into a cylinder and have slow release over time. So quite a few of those kinds of presentations, and also on what can we get from nanotechnology, why invest? Because it's actually quite a long process in terms of process chemistry. But in the end, there can be an enormous gain in terms of financial gain, and there could be cost savings because it becomes much less costly to produce over time because they're such tiny molecules. And so actually some of the work on optimization has actually been looking at how can we move a few of these drugs along the nanotechnology pathway. Lastly, this slide is for Marco, who asked me to put it in. He thought it was great that now these long-acting and injectables are starting to look at other drugs, other cures, other approaches, and there's already been a long-acting, we believe, for not for Ebola, for malaria coming down the pike. So this approach from HIV is being taken into other drugs and other disease programs. So the good news and the bad news. Treatment appears to be working, and resistance studies on the whole look okay, but then there are caveats. So you already saw this study about the population-based impact studies and assessments. I call them the FIAs. I don't know what they should be called, but I'll skip right over to the 90-90-90 if you can see those, because these studies looked, as you know, at Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Zambia. Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Zambia at those aware, those on treatment, those virally suppressed in the light blue. And as you can see, overall, 88% in the combined effect were suppressed out of those who were enrolled into this study. But when you start to divide it out by age and by gender, there are differences. And certainly the age 15 to 24, only 79% were suppressed, and that cascade looks much worse in terms of only 46% know that they were suppressed. What we do know from this group is they are going to be looking at the resistance patterns for transmitted drug resistance among incident cases using their recency testing, and we are looking forward to that because we do believe that will be helpful for us in the future to understand what's happening. I think this was one of my favorite sessions, even though it's not usually what I go to see, but it was about outcomes from pregnancies on ARV. Now, the bad story is, yes, we know that ARVs can cause, as a whole, adverse outcomes, and as included in there is stillbirth, neonatal deaths, etc. But on the whole, the drug that is seemingly doing the best and the safest is tenofovir, FTC, and efavirenz. And remember, 5, 6, 7 years ago, we were worried that efavirenz was a major teratogen. And what we know now, coming out of Botswana study, is that actually it seems to be the safest in terms of the outcomes. And again, this is across the board for stillbirths, neonatal deaths, and they also looked at a number of the other outcomes. So what's the bad side of this is there is emergent integrase inhibitor resistance appearing. There was also another study showing that with monotherapy, integrase inhibitor does appear. And so in many ways, the one drug option seems to be off the table now, at least for dolutegravir 50, and nobody really is thinking about that for the future right now. However, in the United States, not only are they having lower incidence, with the introduction of integrase inhibitors, they seem to have a stabilized transmitted resistance pattern. So with more modern agents over the last 2 to 5 years or so, you can see that the resistance to NRTIs in blue, NRTIs in red, PIs in green, and integrase inhibitors starting to inch up there, but they're stabilizing or coming down. And I think it will be with time that we'll start to see some integrase inhibitor go up, resistance go up, but in many ways, integrase inhibitor regimens appear to be quite durable. And again, that is reproduced for all of the US for transmitted drug resistance among MSM as well. We also saw that in the TASK trial, many of you have recall the TASK trial that was presented in Durban, which is a community-based ARV test and treat all intervention, that they also looked at whether pre-treatment drug resistance was associated with viral load suppression differentials. And what they saw, that prevalence of pre-treatment drug resistance was approximately 9% in those who are both recently and chronically infected, and it was mostly driven by the K103, which is an NNRTI or efavirenz resistance mutation. And when they looked at those people over time, those who have the resistance and those who do not, and looked at their viral suppression up at 18 months since starting, those lines were essentially the same. So they did not see any virological difference. Now, they are going to be investigating this further, but I think this tells us something, that we need to look at what does resistance mean? Do people do clinically well? Do we need to follow them over time, etc.? So these population-based studies do help us. I'll just jump over that. For third line therapy, there was a study showing that actually our current WHO regimens of using lopinavir, ritonavir, or atazanavir, and or darunavir seems to work. So in many ways, I think we're in a good situation to have those. And again, some acute infection issues that have come up where there can be and have been seen cases of integrase inhibitor now being transmitted. So just more evidence to say we're going to have to start to scale up our resistance surveillance for integrase inhibitors. For differentiated care, I have 2 studies or so. From Zambia, they showed that if they could extend their clinical visits up to 6 months, it was associated with an improved outcome and a reduced treatment interruption. So better retention, fewer treatment interruptions. So this is something that supports our multi-month scripting approaches, which is nice to see. Now, in terms of integrating ART into the MNNCH services, there was a beautiful presentation from South Africa where they integrated everything and everything got better, which was so nice to see. Breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding, longer breastfeeding, retention in care, all was better. Even vaccines, vitamin supplementation, EID, and maternal contraception. So if you were ever wondering, should you integrate ARVs into MNNCH, well, look at this study, and you should. Okay. So at the end, we had, actually, it was at the beginning of CROI, but I'm ending with this because every year WHO has a think tank, and at our think tank, we were really talking about dolutegravir, and dolutegravir really was an important topic of the meeting. And we said we're not quite ready of changing our guidelines. We currently have it as an alternative first line. We're not ready to change at this point in time. There are studies that are ongoing. We'll be looking at the studies as they come up. TAF, we don't yet have any information about TAF in pregnancy or TAF with TB therapy, and we need that information. Dolutegravir use in second line, we don't have any information, so we're looking for the studies. PI choices, we still like our PI choices of atazanavir, lopinavir, and darunavir. And we want to ensure that if we're doing viral load, that we start to use the results, and we're not using results of viral load. So that's a new era for us that we're going to start working on. And with that, I will close and hand over and thank all my co-authors, those who have helped me with slides and others. Yeah.
There wasn't really a huge amount on testing in the conference, so we can catch up a bit of time. There was, when there were anything on testing, it seemed to focus on self-testing. In fact, there wasn't a single session in the conference devoted to testing. There was virtually nothing on partner notification, but there was some encouraging results coming out of the 2 big combination prevention trials, and I'll talk about those and how well they're doing with testing the entire population. I'm going to start with probably what I thought was the most exciting thing for us at WHO at CROI was our pre-meeting on self-testing. We launched our guidelines, as you all know, for World AIDS Day, and really self-testing is catching the imagination of many countries. And I'm just noting there the countries that presented at the meeting, either having started or thinking about or having pilot projects in self-testing. And we have all these presentations available in a Dropbox, so we can supply those if you're interested in more detail. But I really wanted to highlight a project from Vietnam, which started to offer self-testing in May last year. And it was delivered through a range of 15 community-based organizations, and using all sorts of different mechanisms. And they used both blood-based and oral fluid assays, and they had ways of giving the information to the clients on how they could use these through package inserts, posters, video tutorials. Their results are really quite remarkable here. What I think is particularly noteworthy is that Vietnam has an overall adult prevalence of about 5%, and in conventional testing sites, the testing positivity rate is about 1%, whereas using the self-test through these community-based organisations, the positivity rate was 8%. Not only was that much higher than any other method in the country, but also the linkage was really high. And this has been something that people have worried about, that self-testing to linkage to confirmation and then to be enrolled in ART would be difficult. But I think what the Vietnam program shows, that if you do this with community-based organizations who can support not only people to be able to self-test, but then to link, you can really achieve some remarkable results. On the other side there, again, this method was really getting people who tested for the first time in groups that really need to be tested. So sex workers, gay men and others, men who have sex with men, people who inject drugs, and their sexual partners. And the other criticism that people have about self-testing, or the other worry people have about self-testing, is, can people do this accurately? And again, this was very, very reassuring. The concordance between the people who self-tested and the trained testers was extremely high. So I really want to, we should all go away with real encouragement from this example, and Vietnam is going to now scale this up, built on these results. We've also been very keen partners in the STAR project, and the STAR project is a UNAIDS-funded project, and they presented their results looking at delivering self-testing for a whole range of mechanisms in Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And all of these countries, and particularly Zambia and Zimbabwe, have really quite high rates of testing already. They have well-established programs in clinics and outreach, and even particularly in Zambia through home-based testing. But yet there's still this big testing gap. And the self-testing project, providing self-test kits through community-based distribution, enabled about 20 to 25% of people to test for the first time. They achieved relatively high positivity rates, and they particularly, the groups that really favoured this method, interestingly, were young people, which is what we would expect, but also some of the older people and older men who had never had any other opportunity to test. It's a rapidly growing, as you can see, that these are just results for December, and these are rising exponentially as we speak. In the conference, there were a number of projects looking at acceptability, and these two projects were amongst men who have sex with men. One from Kenya, and in this project, it was people were randomly allocated to testing in a health centre or oral self-test. And really, you can see there's very little difference between the two groups, except that the self-testers had a much higher positivity rate. Linkage to care was also much higher was similarly high in both groups, and reassuringly high, above 80%. In New York, gay men are a group that are often particularly vulnerable to HIV and not accessing testing, and this is a project to try and reach men who weren't going into clinics. So HIV tests were given away to people who were contacted through websites and dating apps. And what was very encouraging about this was this method was again highly acceptable. It reached young black men and young Hispanic men, and particularly people with low income. So it's really reaching those who are not going to clinical settings. And another advantage of or another proposed way of utilising self-testing is to support testing of male partners. And another study here presented was negative women in Kenya who were given self-test kits to their partners. What was very encouraging again was that it was highly acceptable, and 55% of the women, and they were given 3 tests. That they could give, they could test themselves, they could test their partner, and they could test someone else. That could be a friend or household member. And 55% were able to test with their partner. Another 34% were able to persuade their partner to be tested, but the testing wasn't done together. And of the remaining women who didn't test, many of these experienced intimate or were worried about intimate partner violence. And I think what's really important in this study is that women who fear intimate partner violence make that decision themselves that self-testing of their partners isn't for them. And so we do worry that self-testing can lead to adverse outcomes. But I think if women are given that opportunity to understand what self-testing is, what the benefits are, they can make an informed and rational decision as to whether they should offer it to their partners. There was only one abstract in the whole of the conference on partner notification, and it was a modelling study based on a study that it was based on a study from Peter Cherich in Kenya, which had shown partner notification to be highly successful. And basically, it was a modelling study to say that partner notification can be very cost-effective and should be something that should be considered. But there was nothing else on this very promising way to increase ways of diagnosing people relatively cheaply with a high positivity rate. I'm going to sort of finish up now by giving some results from the 2 large combination prevention trials which aim to offer testing to all people. And there were two poster presentations from the pop-up study. And here, this was data on young people, and the home-based volunteers, the CHIPs, were able to reach a large number of young people at home. And as you can see, the percent who access testing from the baseline after one round of CHIPs went up from 25 to 88%. And this is between the 15 and 19-year-olds. It was more likely to be females. So again, as we find across all testing modalities, it is more difficult to contact men, be they old or young. So the conclusion from this is that despite this very labour-intensive, highly successful method to get everybody tested in a community, you're still going to miss men. They also presented another poster which looked at improving testing amongst pregnant women. We assume that all pregnant women will test early in an antenatal clinic, but this door-to-door testing showed that there were women who weren't attending antenatal clinic, and it was a way that you could really improve HIV testing and identify new women with HIV much earlier in their pregnancy, which obviously has advantages. And finally, the BCPP, the Botswana Combination Prevention Project, which is another of these huge studies aiming to test the entire population. This study, they were looking at linkage to care following testing. They've been, again, highly successful in getting testing accepted through a whole range of community-based and door-to-door settings. What's interesting here, Botswana has already a very high coverage of testing, so only 24% of people who they tested who were positive were not already on ART. And then they looked at ways to link those people to immediate treatment. The majority, 77%, linked to care within 30 days, and this was with an appointment made, a single SMS, and they also had at the time of testing CD4. By the time you got to a year, you had 84% linkage, but these people needed much more nurturing along the way. They needed further counselling, either in person or by phone, text messages, etc. And there is still this small group who, whatever you do, it's very difficult to link them to care. And these tend to be younger men, as always, and people in employment. So although they conclude that this was highly successful, their methods to test and link, if we're really going to get to that 90, we have to think of ways to really support those men, those younger men and those men in work.
So so my job today is really to give you a little bit of a flavor of what's new in terms of pediatric and adolescent HIV. And as Meg said, obviously a lot of these presentations are available online, and I would really recommend to go back to those because a lot of details are provided. Before I start, I want to thank Lynn Moffinson, who was so kind to share her slides with us, and so I'm going to use those to highlight some of the key elements. So we'll touch on testing, treatment, and service delivery, and I will start with testing. And I really want to start with what I think was the key highlight of this conference, at least from the pediatric HIV perspective, I think. We had the first randomized evidence to support the use of point-of-care EID to really promote better retention and faster ART initiation in infants infected with HIV. This cluster randomized trial was undertaken in Mozambique in 16 clinics. And as you can see, testing was provided by nurses, and the investigators compared the standard of care with the use of DPS and result return, electronic result return, with the use of point-of-care EID, and assess a number of different outcomes. And in this slide, you can see, and probably it's a little bit small, but all the outcomes that were measured really favored the point-of-care EID arm. And in the Kaplan-Meier curve that you see on the right side, you can see very clearly how there was a very clear and statistically different difference between the two arms, not just in terms of the number of children that were started on ART, but also how quickly they were started on ART. And so this study really showed how point-of-care can reduce loss to follow-up in the testing to treatment cascade and really increase and speed up ART initiation. So I think authors really emphasize also how point-of-care is not EID is not the magic bullet, and it's very much something that needs to put in the context of strengthening EID programs overall. And I think it's certainly a study that I would recommend you to look at more carefully. And here in the audience we have Laura our colleague that was also one of the co-authors, so I'm sure she will be happy to give you more details if you're interested. Moving into treatment, so we really want to identify children as soon as possible because we want to start them as soon as possible. And it was there was a very important presentation that probably present the first substantial cohort of infants that have started on treatment very early. And this is coming out of the Leopard study that happened in at the Rahima Musa Hospital in Johannesburg in South Africa. And you can see here that children in this graph started treatment at different time points. But this presentation at the conference really focused on the 30 that started treatment within the first 48 hours. And I think what it was interesting overall in terms of the baseline characteristics that were presented is that we've always thought that RNA, that viral load in infants, it should be very, very high. And yet, as you can see from the graph on the bottom of the right side, you can see it was pretty diverse viral load. And so there are cases where viral load is actually not that high. But what was most interesting is that these study really described more in detail the viral dynamic of and the virological response to treatment of these children that were started initially on an enaviricum-based regimen and then switched to a lopinavir-based regimen. There was quite a significant variability of response, I must say, and something that definitely surprised a lot of the people in the room. But I think what attracted the most attention is those 3 kids that became the PCR negative, and these are described more in detail on the right side of the slide. And I think what was interesting, particularly for those in the room that are really engaged with the functional cure research agenda, it was this bimodal trend in the suppression that was demonstrated in these 3 kids. And of course, for those of us that are more involved in the public health elements of this, obviously this was a point to reflect on, particularly in light of the potential negative results that you would get if you would test a child that is on ART at this time point. So the complexity of all of this obviously needs to be kept in mind. But how early does it need to be? And I think the key question is, does it need to be that early everywhere and for everyone? And this trial that I wanted to flag, it's a trial that was conducted in South Africa that investigated the time of ART initiation in a specific subset of children presented with severe malnutrition, and looked at whether starting treatment early or starting treatment later would be better. And again, this slide, the numbers are a little bit small, but the results of the trial basically show that starting treatment later is better in terms of immunological, virological response, but also in terms of growth parameters. And but I want to emphasize that when we talk about later initiation, we're still talking about pretty early stages. It's about I believe 23 days as compared to 5 to 6 days. And I think there's been a lot of discussion around what the potential explanation for this might be. And obviously, the results of this trial needs to be looked at more carefully. But I do think there is certainly an important component around drug absorption and how that results into the treatment response at 48 weeks. Moving into, so when children are started on treatment, then what happens when they stay on treatment for some time, and how frequently do they switch? And this is really a broad analysis that was done on a really huge data set coming from the CITRA cohort that brings together data from almost everywhere in the world, as you can see. There were about 93,000 children included in this analysis, and again, as you can see, from different regions. These children were all on first-line ART, and they were started on different first-line regimen, largely dependent on where they were coming from. As you can see, the first column emphasized data coming from sub-Saharan Africa, where most of them were obviously on an European-based regimen, which we know to be really the most frequent regimen being used in first line for children, even though not necessarily the most optimal. And we're really trying to make sure that this practice change with the introduction of better formulation in sub-Saharan Africa. But the key point of this analysis was that looked at about a median follow-up of about 27 months, is that you can see that there's not much switching happening, and in some parts of the world. So the median time to switch was about 25 months, which I think it's probably shorter than we had expected on average. The median age was about 8.6 years, and obviously the majority of those that switched from an NNRTI-based regimen to a PI-based regimen. And overall, by 3 years of ART, there was a cumulative switch of 3.1%, that, as I said earlier, it's not necessarily that high. And you can see there is pretty wide variability, and the green line, which is the extreme, refers to the US, and the bottom line, which is the purple line, looks at sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa and Botswana. And I think as a reflection, of course, we need to think about, obviously these reflect practices, clinical practice, but also reflect the availability of viral load monitoring. And it's pretty clear that in the context where you have limited option for second line in children and you don't have viral load, switching children, it's more difficult. And we know that that's not happening in low and middle income countries. These analyses also investigated some of the key correlates to switching to second line, and these are listed here in the slide, but clearly more to look at. And obviously, this is an observational data set that has a lot of limitations, but I think it's really the first analysis that really looked at such a big data set from such a broad cohort. Now, looking into the more drug-related aspects, many of you that deals with children know that obviously treating children, young children, is particularly difficult, but it's even more difficult when we have to treat them, we have to treat those with TB co-infection. And this study that had started, I think, about 3 years ago, that also informed our most recent revision of the guidance, looked at how to address the issue of drug-drug interaction between lopinavir and rifampicin, which we know being problematic because it does reduce the level of lopinavir quite significantly. And we know that the doubling the dose is not really working in children. So this approach investigating the use of additional ritonavir in order to get to a 1-to-1 ratio between lopinavir and ritonavir, and really confirm that this approach is viable and it's comparable to standard lopinavir ritonavir without rifampicin, and really supports our guidelines and the recommendations are included in our guidelines at the moment. So moving into newer drugs, Meg has already mentioned about the excitement around dolutegravir, and obviously we're really keen to see these drugs becoming available for children as soon as possible. This slide has a lot of details and a lot of numbers that obviously I won't go into, but I want to flag it because this is the first data of the use of dolutegravir in children between 2 to 6 years. We know dolutegravir at the moment is approved by the European Union down to 6 years, but we don't have approval below that. And this is the first data becoming available for that age cohort. And in this age cohort, you can see dolutegravir being tolerable and effective. So very promising results with what is expected to be a really important drug in the future. I also want to point out that, however, this formulation that was investigated is the granules, which is not necessarily what will be put forward for regulatory approval. So we will have to wait additional data for dispersible tablets that hopefully will become available by mid-year. Another new drug that we really want to have for children is TAF. Unfortunately, there's been huge delays in the pediatric development for this drug, which is approved down to 12 years, but not below that. And this is the first data looking at the use of TAF in children 6 to 12. Interestingly, the dose is the same, so that's part of the reason why we already have data and the formulation is the same. And as you can see from this slide, again, I won't go into the details, but overall confirm the the pretty good tolerability profile of this drug, both in terms of renal safety as well as bone mineral density, which we know was a really key problem and a key barrier for use of tenofovir in children. So promising results, but again, we really need to speed up development of this drug for children. We don't at the moment have a viable formulation for children, and so there's more work that needs to happen globally to really push for Gilead to develop this. I want to close with service delivery. I must say that unfortunately there wasn't really much on service delivery for children, and I really hope that in the future we will see more CROI addressing different service delivery models for children, but there was something more for adolescents, and I think that this study just really emphasized the importance of really thinking about better service delivery model for adolescents, because we know that, again, they are more difficult to retain in care, and particularly the ones from 10 to 15, 15 to 19 years old. And again, these two graphs just confirm that, in case we really needed to yet another study to suggest that. But what was interesting is that loss to follow-up was higher for those adolescents that were pregnant, that were sicker, and those that presented more recently. And again, more details can be found on the poster, so in the interest of time, I won't go into the details here. But what I wanted to flag is this pretty innovative service delivery model for adolescents that was tested in Haiti, and it was tested out of these cohort, it is a pretty well-established cohort of adolescents. And what this study evaluated was a community cohort care-based model, and compared that with the standard individual practice where you would have a single adolescent presented to the facility and being taken care of by different people depending on the HIV services provided. And in this specific case, what they did, they basically developed cohorts of 8 adolescents that were reached at the community level and that were provided care by one nurse, so one individual providing an integrated package of care, anything they might need, and at the same time counseling and peer support. So what they showed with this study is really that community cohort care actually worked, improved retention, but also improved the number of adolescents that started ART. So pretty good results. However, it did emphasize how virological suppression is still not good, and I think this as well as always help us to reflect on the fact that adherence for adolescents is challenging, and we just have to really work more and more on that. So I will stop there, and thank you very much. There's additional slides for people that might be interested in additional abstracts that were presented.
Okay, hello from back of the room. Thank you so much, first of all, Peter, Meg, Rachel, and Martina for really interesting but also well-summarized presentations. I'm sorry to be putting a little bit of a time pressure. And this is really becoming a very nice tradition between WHO HIV department and UNAIDS colleagues to really present CROI news with our staff and partners and interested parties every year at this time of the year. And we have some 80 people already online listening to you. So we have a little bit of time now to collect some questions so that audience can ask for some clarifications. So I think I'll just take maybe 2 or 3 questions from the floor first, and then Celeste, my colleague, will be monitoring the web queries. So if anybody wants to ask questions, just very quickly, swiftly, you can raise your hand.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the presenter. Really, this was great. Mine is more of a question about something that was not reflected here, which from having attended the conference, I thought, at least to my mind, was really incredible, was the presentation those presentations that were made on the second day, the 14th of February, by Annan, but also by Carl June, talking about the potential of using cancer treatment and some of the innovation around T-cell engineering and the potential of that for a cure of HIV treatment. And I thought that really was significant. The day after, a number of people have been picking that news around HIV cure and its potential. So I thought maybe it would be great to hear a little bit about that and the potential role that this could play and what may be the role of WHO and UNAIDS in giving voice to this, because he also spoke about the fact that in the context of cancer treatment, there are already a number of trials that are going on, but there is none with regard to HIV and the potential use of such technologies to address HIV and cure.
Maybe one more question.
Thank you. My name is Andreas Ulrich from the Cancer Board, and this is the keyword I would like to address. It's about integration of services. Cervical cancer is very highly prevalent in HIV positive women. And has there been any research on integration of, first of all, screening in HIV positive women and HPV immunization in adolescent HIV positives? Thank you.
Great. Maybe then if you could respond to, okay, just maybe the last.
I assume that you will share the slides with us. May I encourage you as much as possible to add also list of acronyms and abbreviations that makes it possible to understand it better.
Okay, great. Back to the panel.
Shall I kick off on Patrick's question, which I think is a great, I think that, of course, the challenge in this session always is covering the very wide range and trying to make things relevant and appropriate. I ended on the ANRS comment about checkpoint inhibitors in my presentation, and there's an abstract that one can link to there about them, and I commented that it's a very complex and new area, cell-based therapies and using cellular markers. And of course, it's something that the cancer people have been thinking about, and it makes us realize that it is an area that HIV and cancer people are beginning to work together. So specifically, UNAIDS has been working with the IAS, where we work with the Towards a Cure initiative that is really an IAS initiative, but we're on the advisory board for it, as is WHO, and Gottfried and myself attend that each time. And at the IAS pathogenesis conference, there is always a cure symposium that happens beforehand, and the decision for the Paris meeting that's coming up in a couple of months' time is that will specifically bring together cancer and HIV specialists for a cure reflecting on what cancer people are doing, precisely to try to create that sort of stimulating environment. And interestingly, it's been a pre-meeting that has been sold out quicker than any of the other cure things. So I think it's a very nice way of bringing interdisciplinary things. So I share your excitement about it, and I think it's an area to watch and to look at. Cervical cancer, I don't know if have you got some?
Yeah, I just did I didn't scan that for the presentation here, but there's definitely at least 7 presentations on cervical cancer that were made, and in terms of many aspects of already integrating, like the VIA, the screening in Zambia, and then Zimbabwe. I could just see that there's quite a few. So this has been something that PEPFAR has supported over time, and many programs have taken it up. And go ahead.
And I just want to add that for the HPV vaccination, obviously the main focus has been on the adolescent girls, and maybe in some settings adolescent boys, but certainly the sort of catch-up vaccine for sex workers and for gay men is something that's really being considered in an integrated package.
But just to remind people that one of the challenges with HPV vaccination is that it's known to work when it's given before HPV infection. And HPV is a very ubiquitous virus, so that many people acquire HPV when they become sexually active, and therefore we don't know whether there's as much benefit. In fact, we think there's not as much. We don't know if there's any benefit in vaccinating people who are already infected with HPV. HPV sort of comes and goes a bit, so it's less clear. So the target really is to get it into people before they become sexually active and let them grow up protected against it. And that's already having considerable impact in many countries on reduction in cervical cancer rates. I hope that's true. I see we've got people who know much more about cervical cancer than me in the room, but I would just, it's okay, I'm getting the thumbs up to say I said more or less the right things.
Okay, thank you. And now, we don't have any questions on the web, so we are now open for more questions from the room, actually, if anybody's interested. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Meg, were there any presentations on some of the emerging symptoms relating to taking ARVs? And Rachel, usually we think that employment is a good thing, you know, to protect people from getting HIV and also to help them adhere to HIV treatment. But in your case, people who are employed are not being linked to treatment. What do you think is the issue? Then the last one on switching to of treatment among infants, I saw that the key markers were all operational and not clinical. So I am wondering if there are underlying clinical markers, like maybe there were many kids dying or there were many kids getting sick. Thank you.
Okay, on adverse reactions or symptoms, it wasn't the same as when there were studies reported around new symptoms around dolutegravir, such as in Glasgow, where there were CNS reports and other reports. There were still quite a few reports around CNS toxicity with efavirenz, and then the linkage with non-communicable diseases as well as cardiovascular disease. Risk for stroke, risk for MI, and some of the major cohorts, the DAD cohort, also reported out. So there's quite a bit there, but more in the sort of the aging as opposed to new symptoms for new ARVs. One last caveat, I didn't bring it up around dolutegravir. There is a potential concern that's not yet clear whether or not dolutegravir in places where it's used could be associated with TB iris or increased risk of opportunistic infections in iris, simply because it has such a strong effect on the virus.
So David, absolutely. We know, throughout HIV, the cascade, boys and men do much less well, and a lot of it is because they don't go to the health centre regularly. If they're in employment or at school or college, it's taking time out of this, and maybe there are also kind of social and cultural norms to health-seeking behaviour. But certainly, we've got to think differently. What we do know, and I think this is why self-testing is so exciting, is that actually boys and men really like it, and it is a way. But then we have to make sure that we make it easier for them to get to treatment, and home delivery and home initiation, or workplace delivery. I mean, there must be ways to make it easier to fit into their lives, because otherwise they're going to continue to be disadvantaged.
So I wanted to address the switching comment. So I agree, it's mostly operational, and I think part of it is because obviously these type of analysis explore the diversity of the cohort, which, as you've seen, was coming from so many different countries, and it does, as I said, unmask some of the differences in terms of practice and what can be done in countries. So, but I think what came out from the more clinical perspective is, first of all, that those that were on an RTI-based regimen were more likely to switch. We know that its regimen, while it was, it's still widely used, it may be, particularly when you use nevirapine, it's certainly much weaker than others that we currently recommend. And the other element was older age, and I think, again, these continue to speak to the fact that adherence is challenging as children gets older and get into adolescence. So I think those are the two elements that maybe, were different from others.
Okay, our time is up. So really great appreciation and a round of applause to our presenters today. Thank you so much for coming, and then we'll share the materials soon with you. Thank you.